Without further ado, who's starting us off?
I'll go first.
Jake. Jake Hodesh from People's Liberty.
How's everybody doing? Everybody awake? Very good. Can you hear us okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right, sweet. Let me make sure. I was being nice and I'll let the guys have their slide up. This is actually the first slide here. I have 7 slides. They have like 70. So I'll try not to take all the time. But we thought it would be interesting if I joined for the conversation to talk a little bit about how this project was funded in Cincinnati, a little bit about People's Liberty. And part of the reason that this might work is because the foundation landscape here in this town is rich. And part of the reason People's Liberty happened in Cincinnati is because we too have a very rich, interesting, dynamic foundational community, and people are pressing us to do bigger work and think differently about how we fund and who we fund. Also pressing us on what problems matter, what opportunities are out there, and how we can fund people to go look at those problems differently, solve those problems, seek out those opportunities. I work for the Hale Foundation, and I help run People's Liberty, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then I'll pass it off to Kevin and Joe. Ralph and Carol Ann Hale are both now not with us. Carol Ann came from a banking family in northern Kentucky and greater Cincinnati, and Ralph helped run the business that was her father's business. And they grew great wealth in the region and cared deeply about the region and were super active while they were living. They didn't have a big family or any children to leave the money to, so there was a foundation that was created in their name, the Hale Foundation. And those dollars are dedicated to improving the lives of people in greater Cincinnati and our urban landscape. And we as Hale Foundation employees are stewards of their vision and their desires, and part of that, their dreams and the things that they felt were important in the city, part of that was being in the street and at a storefront level. Ralph was a banker, and he was the type of guy that wasn't behind a desk or behind the teller's window. He was in the lobby talking to people, talking to business people or individuals that needed a loan or couldn't make rent, needed help. He was there for people, very, very truly. His door was always open, and that was true for the people that worked for him and for the people that banked at his banks. And in that image, here we are years after his death, keeping on their family name, and the name People's Liberty was the name of their bank in northern Kentucky. And that name and that moniker and the logo had kind of fallen by the wayside through mergers and acquisitions. And it was something we wanted to bring back about 5 years ago when the foundation started thinking differently about how we fund. At the time, we were funding 501c3 nonprofits and CDCs, community organizations, just like most foundations do. And we challenged ourselves to think differently. We created People's Liberty as a little offshoot of the foundation. And for the last 3 years, we've been funding individuals directly to go seek opportunities in greater Cincinnati or to go solve problems in greater Cincinnati. And Joe and Kevin, whether this was a problem or an opportunity, I don't know. We'll probably talk about that later. But they presented an idea and received $10,000 of funding from People's Liberty, essentially the Hale Foundation. So People's Liberty is a philanthropic lab that invests in people directly. Literally, you as a human, with your name, apply for funding, which I'll talk about in a moment. And if you are so fortunate as to win a grant from us, we cut a check to you as an individual to go seek out a great opportunity in our town or to solve one of our town's problems. And this is an image that I love. These are the people that have won grants so far from People's Liberty, as well as some of the folks that have work for us or have come in and worked for us. You'll see ages and races. You can't really see the neighborhoods that they're representing, but it's far and wide, and that matters to us. We don't have metrics that we need to meet, but it just feels right. And if you come to our building and come to the workspace, you'll see these people working on their projects, and we've started to build a movement and a really great community of which Kevin and Joe are definitely a part. It's a 5-year initiative. We started and launched in 2015, and it closes in 2020. We did that on purpose. We wanted people to have a sense of urgency, not to delay applying, but to come and apply now. Are there problems or opportunities that you see in your backyard, in your neighborhood, on your block, in your town? Go after them now. And we offer 3 different grants. Every year we offer 2 people the opportunity to quit their job, stop everything they're doing, and apply for a $100,000 grant to go seek a big opportunity in our town or to solve a problem in our town. 2 people each year win this grant. What Kevin and Joe applied for is the next one, which is called a project grant in 16 people each year in nights and weekends, in their free time, apply for a project grant, a $10,000 grant to go seek an opportunity or solve a problem in our town. And they move through the process in a cohort of about 8 people. And then 6 people a year apply, more than 6 apply. 6 people win a Globe grant. And what we do is we have a storefront in the building where we work, and we also have a storefront in another neighborhood in town. And these grantees get a storefront for about 3 or 4 months and $15,000 to transform that storefront. This is not an art installation, and it's not really a retail play. It's about inviting people from the street into the space. We've had folks who have set up micro cinemas, 40-seat movie theaters in neighborhoods that don't have movie theaters. We've had a woman set up a play library, a lending library for toys and games for neighborhood kids, bringing the best, most amazing $15,000 worth of toys to a neighborhood so that kids can come in and play or take them home, and a whole host of other projects that are storefront related. Part of the way we set this up was both monetarily and your level of commitment. Are you ready to quit your job and go all in? Is nights and weekends work for you? And then also this idea of storefront. Do you need a physical space to do what you want to do? And part of our job is coaching people to the right opportunity. The last thing I'll talk about is we hire folks, really young talent. It's our only quasi-age restricted opportunity. We're looking for young designers, writers, bloggers, videographers, photographers coming out of school early in their career who come work for us in 3-month rotations. And this supplements our really small staff. And we help and try and assist all our grantees in getting a brand and communications and social media, and just kind of like fully wrapping this idea so you can launch on a limited budget with a limited time and really launch your project out to market. For something like what Kevin and Joe did, our folks did not do this by any means, and they'll talk about how this was produced. But we did help in finding or encouraging them to visit different designers in town. They use the heck out of our space, and we're always in the building, and some other folks that other things they'll talk about. I think Kevin and Joe, just in closing, I think Kevin and Joe represent a lot of the ideals that we set forth at People's Liberty. We were hoping that folks who are grinding 9 to 5, but sitting on an idea that they've been sitting on for days, months, weeks, years, were inspired by our call to apply, okay, and kind of get off their butt and do something about it. Maybe the temptation of a $10,000 grant and support and a workspace could get people in greater Cincinnati to take advantage of the opportunity and go do that thing they've been thinking about. We always use the anecdote, if you will, of 2 people sitting at a bar, and you're sitting next to that person that always says that thing, if I had enough money, I would just do this, or if somebody would just fund me, I would go and do this. And while we were developing and creating People's Liberty, that kept on coming back again and again and again. And if I can say one thing about the Neighborhood Playbook, I think it was that. These are guys with full-time jobs that had a dream for what could be maybe their next job or their next opportunity, and they use this to their full advantage. We're super excited, and I wish I could tell you about all of our grantees and all the things they're doing, but just to say, maybe I can leave you with this, that foundations can do this work. It takes a lot of courage, because it's different than sitting on the top floor of a building and not being approached, to not have to do hand-to-hand combat and talking to grantees and people who want money. It's difficult. You're always being approached and approached and approached. But we've found, at least in the 3 years and in the years to come, that the work is extremely meaningful, that people matter, and investing directly in people to garner real results is powerful work. It's community work, and I think these guys really represent some of the best of what we've funded and some of the best success that we've had so far as funders. So thank you all so much for giving us your attention, and I'll hand it off to Tom.
You know, geez, Jake, took all the time. Can't believe you threw us under the bus on the slide count. We'll go fast. So my name is Kevin Wright. I'm an executive director of the CDC in Cincinnati. I'll talk a little bit about the neighborhood I work in. I think one of the themes of Jake's presentation and what Joe and I are going to talk about is that what we've discovered in this sort of new movement back into the city and neighborhood and planning and development, that small can be big. And I think that fits into what Jake was talking about in the sense that what can someone do with just $10,000, or what can someone do with just given a storefront? And that was really Joe and I 3 years ago. We were those guys at a bar, sitting around talking about an idea. We first met and we had been working in neighborhood planning and development for some time. We began saying, you know, we're observing something that's happening in neighborhood and planning and development across the country in certain neighborhoods that's really working well on a number of levels. Why aren't more people doing it? And that led to the idea behind the neighborhood playbook, which Joe will talk a little bit more about in detail, led to us creating this field guide that we thought we could put in the hands of people around the country, around Cincinnati, who could use it to begin testing this new model. What's been interesting about the last couple of years is it's really taken off. So the books have sold really well, but much better than expected across the country. We've been asked to come speak on it in numerous places. And that led us to what we call economic recovery, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. How does this fit into a larger new framework around growing neighborhoods and growing cities? And so I want to start with a couple of slides. And I'm admittedly, I'm probably preaching to the choir here. You guys have been doing a great job of bringing speakers into the city as part of this planning process. You're good urbanists, I think, and you know what works and what doesn't to some degree. But I want to start with this image of this small town in Idaho. This is a compact, historic, walkable business district. This is what we are all taught to build. This is what works, right? This is parking on either side of the street. Traffic is going slow. People are walking around. You have retail, you have housing, you have historic buildings intact. And this is how our places were built. And that's what I want to sort of start off the conversation here on. This is how we built places. We built places small. We built places incrementally. We learned as we grew. And we produced some of the greatest places on earth, right? And we produced these places that now people are flocking back to. But in many ways, we're screwing them up. And part of that is because, you know, about 50 years ago, for whatever reason, we changed how we built places. And we know the reasons. We built highway systems. We got addicted, what we call addicted to supply. You're going to hear Joe and I talk a lot about demand and supply, and focusing on demand instead of supply. We redline neighborhoods. I mean, let's be frank about it. We engage in institutional racism. We put African Americans and people in poverty in one place, and we put people in the middle class in another place. And we built places like this that were dependent on the car, that created social chasms in our regions, created environmental problems. And now we're moving back in. And the problem is our observation, that as we're moving back in, we're bringing that same method of development back with us. So that supply addiction, that go big or go home. And there are institutional problems with this approach. I mean, this is how banks have financed development in the suburbs for decades. Now those same developers who built what was working in the suburbs are now coming back into the city and building the same type of project, just product, it's just in a different form. And we get products like this, sort of poorly designed buildings, parking in the front, no retail on the first floor, sort of jammed into historic walkable neighborhoods that are compact places with existing people and existing buildings. This isn't a cornfield we're building on in the city, we're building in places. And we're getting, with this supply addiction approach, we're getting this kind of development instead of a more thoughtful, integrated process of building back these neighborhoods. And this is a photo from Pittsburgh that, in, if you've been there, the East Liberty neighborhood of Pittsburgh, which is a really good example of great incremental urban infill. And so what I want to talk about today, and what Joe wants to talk about today, is how can this new approach that we're going to walk you through help us grow faster, help us grow smarter, and help us grow more inclusively. And instead of taking a supply-focused approach to planning and development, how can we focus on building demand? How can we focus on working with residents to build demand for place, to shape demand for place, to start small, then really shape what supply development looks like in our neighborhoods and make sure that it's part of who we are as a neighborhood and it's being done with us and not to us. So as I said, I work in Walnut Hills in Cincinnati. A little bit about Walnut Hills. I've been there about 7 years. It's just how many, let me ask, has anybody been to Walnut Hills? A few people. Cameron has. And I talked to the DAP alumni, so I know you've been. Walnut Hills is a similar story to a lot of the neighborhoods you guys work in or you know. Highway cut through it in the 70s. Many of the streets were converted to one-way streets, fast traffic, became a pass-through neighborhood instead of a two neighborhood. About 75% African American, high poverty rates, low homeownership rates. I think we all know the story. However, the neighborhood used to be known as the city's second downtown. It's right up the hill from over the Rhine downtown where we've seen a big resurgence. It's right next to Uptown. So it's adjacent to the two biggest job centers in the region. So the question is sort of why aren't these places working? If you have big development happening in neighborhoods around them, why aren't these adjacent neighborhoods starting to grow on the fringes? And this is what it looked like 6-7 years ago. And you can put yourself in my shoes. I was straight out of grad school. I had a master's degree in urban planning. I'd worked in journalism for about 7 years before that, but I had no experience in community development. I told someone a joke beforehand that I was kind of cocky for the first year I had the job because I was like right out of grad school. I became an executive director of CDC, so I was kind of walking around being like, yeah, I killed the interview. Yeah, I must have done a great job. And then I realized really no one wanted the job. Like, oh, no one else applied. We were a 40-year-old CDC. We had a bunch of bad debt on our books. To be honest, we probably should have filed bankruptcy. We didn't have an office. We didn't have health insurance. We didn't have Wi-Fi. We're now a bigger CDC with 7 full-time staff. But you put yourself in my shoes. I was responsible for bringing back that second downtown, bringing back to life this place that had one-way streets that people flew through. No one was living there. The buildings were vacant. People were living in the neighborhood, but not in the core. A lot of imagery like this, boarded up buildings, graffiti, crime, etc. And my job was to figure out how to bring these buildings back to life. I talk about this old firehouse here as a good example of what we're talking about, and a good example of why my job was so stressful at the time, because the neighborhood really wanted a restaurant in this firehouse. That was their dream vision. They said, I want a restaurant here. I don't want it torn down. It's a beautiful building. And all the so-called experts and the folks at the city were telling me, you'll never get a restaurant there. Don't even try. Maybe you'll get an office use. Maybe you should move your office in there. And I'll come back to that in a second. But there was this issue of supply and demand. We owned a lot of buildings. So with our left hand, we've been buying a lot of buildings for cheap with our tax increment financing dollars. But what we started doing with our right hand was really interesting. We knew that we owned buildings. We knew that we had to develop those buildings. So we knew that eventually we would bring that supply development on. But we knew that would take a couple of years, at best, maybe more. But there was no demand. And partially maybe because it was my communications background, journalism background, but I dove into this idea of how do I create an excitement around this neighborhood? How do I show these investors, developers, retailers that if you build it, they will come? Because frankly, they weren't even returning my phone calls at this point. And as part of this process of thinking about demand creation, in demand discovery, I stumbled across this place, which is now known as the 5 Points Alley. I was walking around with some police officers, and we were discussing the criminal activity in the commercial corridor, and they brought me back to these alleys, which I had never been to. And they said, if you need to clean these up. This is where the source of the crime is. There was a lot of prostitution, trash dumping, drug activity back here. You can see in the map on the right-hand corner, if you can see that our main intersection, this was hidden, tucked away behind some buildings, right behind that main intersection. And so we said, okay, well, we can do a cleanup. Every neighborhood does cleanups. Anybody in here who works in a neighborhood knows a big part of your job actually usually is working with corporate volunteers, neighborhood residents to do cleanups. So that was easy. So we did a cleanup, cleaned it out, we filled a 40-foot dumpster full of God knows what, and we said, if this is going to be successful, we need to bring people back. So we said, let's do a cleanup on a Saturday, let's invite the volunteers back on Sunday for what we call a pop-up beer garden. So we did that. And what happened was really amazing. First time we did it, we just opened a keg of beer, had a food truck, and a musician from the neighborhood. We invited the volunteers back, so about 40, 50 volunteers came back to the alley, drank beer, had a good time. They, of course, took photos, posted them on Instagram, Twitter, etc. We did another cleanup the next month. 100 people came to beer garden. And they weren't just the volunteers. People came from all over the city and all over the neighborhood. By the third one, we were at 300, then 400, then 500 people. And this summer, the first summer we did this, this became a huge demand driver for Walnut Hills. Total game changer. We started getting calls from the news media. We started getting calls from developers, investors. What is going on in Walnut Hills? And so we kind of took that and ran with it. Here's an imagery of a poster from early on. And here's some more imagery of some events in space. So what we did is we started inviting investors, developers, retailers to the space. We let them observe it. We intentionally broadcast who was showing up, kind of cataloged who was there. Is it families? Is it young people? What are they spending their money on? What are they doing when they're there? Where are they coming from? And we used this essentially as a market study and as a data study for what could possibly be a customer base for the retail district we were trying to build. At the same time, this became such sort of a popular event that it led to questions of gentrification. So we're a pretty embedded organization in the neighborhood. We have a board of directors that's made up of residents. We work really closely with community council. But people started coming out and saying, who is this? What is this? What is this? What is this for? Because the first couple of years we did this, it was mostly white, young professionals from inside and outside the neighborhood. And it scared people. And it started this dialogue, which was tense but healthy, around what development should look like in Walnut Hills. And this was before any development had happened, right? So this wasn't 3 years down the road when we're protesting a groundbreaking of a $20 million development, which is what tends to happen with this sort of supply side approach to neighborhood development. This was before we built anything. And so we said, okay, well, this is clearly building some momentum for the neighborhood, so what if we use the same approach, but instead of trying to create demand, specifically just any type of demand, what if we tried to shape what that demand looked like? And so we abandoned the pop-up beer gardens and we started partnering with different partners from inside and outside of the neighborhood that drew in a more diverse audience. We changed who we hired to be the musicians. We installed public art. As you can see a mural up above the scene there. I can photo that. And this sort of started to change the face of the 5 Points Alley. This is an article from the Huffington Post that we were in the first year. I call it one of those ridiculous Huffington Post headlines. It doesn't really make any sense, but at the same time, it kind of shows you that this was sort of catching on in a big way and was surprising us because we were in a neighborhood no one was really talking about. And we're listed all of a sudden in the Huffington Post with Seattle and Denver and all these other huge cities. On the left here is an image of some of the public art that we did in the space up on the vacant building. It's called Wind. So we put up these pictures of neighborhood residents, just a normal picture of them smiling on a piece of paper. And over time, Wind blew that piece of paper off to reveal these silly pictures of the neighborhood residents where we took a high-intensity fan and blew it in their face to make them look crazy. And it stayed up there and sort of has a diverse set of faces and projects this image of like, you know what, we're different, but when we have a high-intensity fan blowing in our face, we all look really stupid, right? So it took this idea of diversity, inclusion, and gentrification and applied sort of a silly approach to it that made people laugh and start talking to each other. And we just kept tinkering with the space. Here's another picture of the public art. So you can see the normal faces and the not so normal faces. That's been my favorite is Vanessa in the middle of the top there. She runs our recreation center. We did spoken word poetry nights. We partnered with Mortar, this group Mortar in Cincinnati, who's one of our major partners who does minority entrepreneurship training. And at the end of their entrepreneurship classes, they do a pitch night. They bring like 500 people out to have a competition of who wins a grant, which one of the businesses that went through their entrepreneurship class wins a grant. Build up the 5 points, a bunch of diverse faces. We did more artwork. So we partnered with Artworks in Cincinnati to do mural work. This is a giant mural on the side of a 4-story building that faces downtown. So it's very visible and almost acts like a gateway to the neighborhood now. Here's an aerial of the space now. We raised about $300,000 from the Procter & Gamble Foundation, the Hale Foundation, which is People's Liberty, and the city of Cincinnati to make it a permanent park. So we bought the triangle, we're leasing the alleys from the city, and it's become a permanent public space for people to use, has a stage, a kiosk, and we're starting to see retailers open around it, which I'll talk about. So again, I mentioned earlier left hand and right hand. So with our left hand, or whichever one I said, doesn't matter. With our left hand, we started working on this demand side stuff. Marketing, branding, storytelling, activation, engagement. With our other hand, we were doing the high-end real estate stuff. We were doing historic tax credit applications, tax increment financing, funding, buying buildings, converting the street to a two-way street, changing traffic patterns, adopting a form-based code, all the stuff that's in the toolkit that as urban planners and neighborhood developers we're very familiar with. And so while we're shaping what the face of the neighborhood is through some of these demand discovery approaches, these buildings start changing. So that building goes from vacant to retail, below condos. That old firehouse that we were told we would never get a restaurant in, guess what? We got a restaurant. This was our first project. This is Fireside Pizza. $400,000 project right out of the gate. We didn't start big. We didn't start with something that's scary, something that's risky, something that requires a ton of subsidy. There was $80,000 from the city in this deal. Saved one of our most important buildings, added a restaurant to the neighborhood. And guess where we found the restaurant? They were a food truck that came to the 5 Points Beer Gardens and looked around and saw the neighborhood for what it was then and said they wanted to be here and asked us about the firehouse. I dwell on that because that's a much different approach to saying to somebody, hey, you should open a restaurant in Walnut Hills because in 10 years it's not going to be what it is now. Right? So with Fireside, they came and they said, we like it what it is now. I mean, we hope it continues to grow and evolve, but we think we can be successful here now. This also did another thing. It indicated that when it opened, it was a success. And we hadn't had a restaurant opening in many, many years. And so this then led to the next project, which was called Treverne Flats. 3 buildings, $10 million project just down the street from Fireside. State and federal historic tax credits, forgivable loan from the city, 30 market rate apartments, 5 new retail bays. This opened shortly after Fireside, maybe a year, and leased up as fast as any other project the developer had done in the entire city. Has stayed leased up the entire time, and it's been a big success on the residential side. We now have 5 new businesses in there. We have a cocktail bar, barbecue place, a coffee shop, a sneaker store, and a clothing store. And I have the first barbecue slide since we're in Memphis, of course. Joe has one too, I've been told. Probably not as good as mine. One thing that we're really proud of with this project is that 3 of our 5 tenants in our retail tenants in our project are African American owned businesses. And we think, one of our theories is that because we were intentional about creating and discovering and shaping what demand looked like in the 3 years leading up to this project, that we had said to the city that we are a neighborhood that's racially diverse, that's racially inclusive, and that wants to continue to remain that way. And so when we went out searching for African American owned retail tenants, we didn't really have a problem. And this is a neighborhood that's over 50% African American and has something like a 9% African American business ownership rate. It's abysmal. It's sad. And so we were able to go out and find 3 tenants, and that really helped us moving forward in terms of trust with the community. Next up, and this is Gomez Salsa, which is a taco place right on the 5 Points Alley. And then I want to talk about then how we embarked on a planning initiative, which is a little bit different than how most neighborhoods approach plans. So instead of at the front end, when we were trying to figure out what to do, instead of spending the time to do a plan then, we just got right to work at this demand discovery piece and some of this smart small piece. And we let people respond to that, and we learned from it, and we adapted from it. But by the time we did Fireside and Trevarian Flats, and we started to do some more big-time development, people started asking some tough questions. So how do we actually keep the neighborhood diverse? Can we put policies in place to keep people in their homes, that don't displace people? And then on the other side, the Redevelopment Foundation, which by this point is a pretty large CDC doing some pretty technical stuff, is asking questions like, where do we park people? Where do we put bike lanes? Where do we put metro bus stops? Where do we do infill development versus historic preservation? Where do we do mixed income housing versus market rate housing? And so we embarked with Joe's organization on this Walnut Hills reinvestment plan, kind of midstream of this process of revitalization. We did a lot of neighborhood engagement. We didn't ask people to come to us. We went around the neighborhood to different places, popped up in the local cafe, the rec center at the school. We went to people and asked them where they lived, what they wanted. This is my friend Catherine, who used to be my board president, who was very proud. Joe, in one of the meetings, mentioned Walk Score, which no one had heard of in the meeting, which if you plug your address in, it tells you how walkable your address is. And we had to stop the meeting midway through because everybody breaks out their phone and starts competing with who has the most walkable address. And Catherine won. She has a house, she owns a home, and she has her community garden, she has a business. So those are the walk scores for her 3 establishments. And the plan yielded 4 focus areas for us. It was really a 10-year reinvestment plan. So it looked 10 years out with a market study, and it said, over the next 10 years, where should we focus? What kind of housing should we build to keep the neighborhood inclusive? What does that look like versus infill, et cetera, density? But it really yielded 4 chapters. Invest in people, places, and homes. So we developed a toolkit around how to develop policies to mitigate gentrification. Strengthen connections, because as many of our neighborhoods are, I mean, we drove around some today in Memphis, they're through neighborhoods. You know, we have streets built for 6, 7 lanes that used to be state routes before the highway was built that are still built as a highway, even though they're cutting right through our neighborhood. And so that's the case in Walnut Hills. People travel through it fast. We've got to figure out how to shrink the streets down and make it a 2 neighborhood instead of a 3 neighborhood. The neighborhood is big on public spaces, so we talked about prioritizing public investment and then focusing development resources. Here's some imagery from the commercial district and what's coming next. This shows you where Walnut Hills is in terms of downtown, which is top of the screen. And now we're at a point where we are now those supply developers. So 6 years in, we're starting to grow really rapidly, which is creating new concerns, new problems that we're solving every day. This is a $20 million infill development right next to the firehouse, which will be 125 apartments and new retail. And this is the old Paramount RKO movie theater right on our main corner, which is now under construction as 15 mixed-income apartments, and it's going to have a brewery on the first floor. And we're very proud that the brewery owner, who is Brian holding the plaque in the picture, is going to be Cincinnati's first ever African-American owned and operated brewery. And he was a graduate, so the other 3 guys are part of that group, Mortar, that I mentioned, who does business training. He was one of the graduates of Mortar's class. So now we've been doing this long enough where we actually see the whole process kind of working out. And he's going to open towards the end of the year in the Paramount project. So we're now a neighborhood that is on the verge of $50-60 million of investment in our commercial corridor. But even though these big projects, which are kind of scary and they're heavy on the supply side of development, they have somewhat cruised through the entitlement process, rezoning, funding, because the neighborhood feels so connected, I think, to the development process. So I'm going to end by wrapping this up and then handing off to Joe with a couple of diagrams. So the process now, we think, and this was born out of the neighborhood playbook, is typically we do a plan. And we go out into neighborhoods and we sit in a basement or church basement or a rec center and we put dots on a map and we talk about the future and we say what we want. And it's a process we don't think should go away. It's a good process. But then we stop. And we kind of ask everybody to stop. And time goes by. And if we're lucky, the planners at the city, the developers, the experts, the community development corporations go off and build something. But because there's nothing in the middle and there's a lot of time, what comes out of the ground 2, 3, 4 years later typically gets forgotten about by the people who were involved in the plan. and it's typically some kind of compromise of what they actually said they wanted. So they might have said, I want apartments over retail, but the developer or the market says, can't do retail. Can't do market rate apartments, have to do low-income apartments. Can't save that historic building, have to tear that historic building down. And that leads to, when that happens, sort of an anger, right? People get angry because the design's terrible, they get angry because the buildings are torn down, or they just get scared because they feel like it's big and it's going to displace them or change their quality of life. So as part of this process I just walked with you through for Walnut Hills adds two pieces in the middle. And you can see at the bottom, supply and demand. The playbook is all about the build demand side. How do you find spaces and activate them with the people in the neighborhood to show what the neighborhood looks like, what they'll spend money on, what the demand is for place. The smart small piece is the firehouse, right? Which then grows organically out of the demand discovery or the building demand phase, and something happens that people aren't scared of, that they can kind of wrap their arms around, they can engage with, and you still have the big development piece on the far right. That still happens, but it's a little bit smarter, it's a little bit faster, and it's a little bit more inclusive. So with that, I want to hand it off to Joe.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Joe Nickol. It's awesome to be back in Memphis. Memphis holds a special place in my heart. It is, and I don't know if this is good for Memphis, you be the judge, but this is where I built my first building. As a 24-year-old architect, drawing something that, back in my studio in Pittsburgh, I thought they'll never build this. And I just drew it and gave it to the developer, and I came back several years later, and it's a beautiful building, or I think it's pretty cool, as part of the Legends Park development. So, love coming back to Memphis. The things we've seen in our tours here have been really inspiring and great to see, and we love the work that I think many folks in this room are doing. I'm going to attempt, through the last kind of chapter of our presentation tonight, to take some of the themes and concepts that Kevin just walked through and from his experiences in a specific neighborhood, in a specific city, and try to extrapolate some lessons or some tools or some ideas that may be relevant to the process that you guys are going through now with your 3.0 process or in your own neighborhood development and reinvestment work. And it's kind of built on a core assumption or a core belief that planning as we have historically done it, or at least how we've done it since the World Wars, is an incomplete notion at best. And that perhaps even more risky, that as Kevin described, when we try to bring some of the supply methodology back to our cities without that demand side, we run into some pretty significant problems that can either slow growth, make growth scarier than it needs to be, or stop it altogether. And it certainly leaves a lot of value on the table. And so we think, and we believe in our hearts, that the process has to be amended to go beyond supply and add in that demand component that Kevin described. Because the reality is, we've got some problems and some problems hidden as, or opportunities hidden as problems right before us in all our cities. Particularly if you were an industrial city, kind of rising up over the last couple hundred years, you have buildings like this in places like this, usually over on the wrong side of the tracks, that nobody really knows what to do with, right? You've got the comprehensive plan that may say, we need more housing or more retail or more jobs downtown. Okay, well then how do I do that? Or we may have a downtown master plan, for instance, that says, okay, over in this area, we need to turn this, turn this area to a mixed use district. Great. How do we go about doing that? Is that the right thing to do? And so what we need to do is engage in that left-hand, right-hand methodology of first starting with the demand side. This is that same building. This is in Dayton, Ohio. And testing an idea around how we can reconnect, in this case, to our riverfront, how we can reactivate a building that we have never known what to do with. This is an old cabinet manufacturing building. And then while we're doing that, while we're giving people this amazing public space with low-cost materials, programming, events, kind of crafty and strategic design and storytelling, we can begin to do the hard part of figuring out what to do with the building, raising the millions of dollars to bring that project online, and get much smarter about what that building wants to become and who the market is and who would come there and spend money or time there. In this case, it wasn't flattening that building as is so often the case in many cities, because that's in many ways the easiest thing to do, right? Let's flatten it and bring it back to a greenfield solution that, frankly, the supply side rewards. Let's do this instead. This is going to be a job center, an innovation hub, where all of the 12,000 unfilled jobs in the greater Dayton area can have an opportunity to come acquire new skills with equipment that employers can't, time and equipment that employers can't individually supply, and retrain the workforce right in downtown Dayton and Troy. Troy's the area that this is in. And so when we think going forward, and this might be useful as you guys are thinking about your work here in Memphis, we think there are 4 principles that we're starting to weave through our work in cities all over the country. And they kind of really boil down to 4 things. Some are more controversial or kind of change the paradigm more than others. But first is building on that idea that Kevin introduced, that supply takes time, it's complicated, it's expensive, it takes a lot of brain power and creativity and time, but demand creation can start tomorrow. So the core philosophy that after the planning, after the ideas hatch, we have to get out and start testing it and confirming that demand and creating that demand. The positive change is discovery-driven, incremental, and lean. Let's learn how we go. If we are creating demand with low-cost, low-risk endeavors, if we have to pivot, if we have to learn something new, or we get to learn something new, we can change course without losing our shirts. The development can happen with people and not to them. And so this idea of incremental, demand-driven approach as a way of learning about what something wants to be, rather than just kind of 2 years later after planning is done, coming and doing something to a place. You can learn with them and solve problems and pivot as necessary, as Kevin mentioned with the 5 points. And then one that maybe conflicts mostly with a lot of our pedagogy over the last century is this idea that rooftops follow places, not that retail follows rooftops. The mistake we often make, or at least the assumption we often make when we're doing development work, is that we have to build a critical mass of housing, residential density, before any of the other things that we're talking about can happen. And when we make that assumption, A, we end up waiting a long time, right? Because it's just hard to make that work. But B, we end up leaving a lot of value on the table that creates the actual things that people who live in the neighborhood today are saying that they want in their neighborhood. And it acknowledges a kind of simple notion, and it's even more relevant today in the era of Facebook and Uber and Google Maps and that kind of thing. I can very easily, or at least relatively easily, get you to come to my neighborhood that you've never heard of for an experience. Spend $5 on a sandwich, $6 on a beer, $10 on a show, whatever the case may be. You'll take that risk with me. You'll take that walk. And it's very easy for you to do because you see an event on Facebook, you push a button, a car comes, picks you up, takes you there. You don't even have to look up. You just show up, right? It's a much different proposition if I ask you to sign a 12-month lease, saying that I'm going to deliver these things 2 years in the future. Or I need you to sign a 30-year note on a building, on our house, saying in 5 years you'll be able to walk to a thriving Main Street. That's a different kind of discussion. But when you create those kinds of places that Kevin described making in Walnut Hills, that we're pursuing in the places that we're working, using the demand-driven approach, you can start to demonstrate the need and viability of those amenities like coffee shops and other forms of retail, restaurants, whatever the case may be, public space, before that housing density even arrives. And actually turn the tables and use that as a means to drive residential development, which so many of our neighborhoods are looking for. So Jake and Kevin both talked a little bit about the playbook and some of its background. Those principles are really what, in retrospect, drove the creation of the playbook, and I'll describe just at a high level what it is. You can go to neighborhoodplaybook.com and learn a little more about it. I will say one of the things we stressed a lot about is the design of this book. It's developed as we like to joke, it's 2 books for the price of 1, right? It's a Z-fold. And it's written for 2 primary audiences. On one side, it's for developers and entrepreneurs. And on the other side, it's written for community members. With the same 5 plays for both audiences, written in the language and kind of types of activities that they're used to doing. And so they meet in the middle. We like to also joke that it's a bit of an empathy tool because after going through this process, you see that you're playing for the same team. which isn't so often the assumption going into it. It was really written in response to this we versus them attitude that is so pervasive in neighborhoods that stalls the kind of growth that people are looking to have. We have a few copies outside if you want to thumb through these, through this book in a little more detail. But it's been a really useful tool for us to go through our work. One of those examples of how it's been working is actually something that we did with a neighborhood that Kevin and I live in before we even put the final touches on the book. This is a look from our neighborhood or small city of Bellevue, Kentucky, looking back at Cincinnati. So we're really about a 15-minute walk from downtown Cincinnati. And this is a small city that had a comprehensive plan that acknowledged its main street needed some help. That it needed to go from this kind of sleepy, highly vacant, kind of what we call hobby retail scene, Main Street that wasn't always open when you needed it to be open, and it certainly wasn't giving you the types of experiences or product that you were looking for, and turn it into a vital Main Street that stayed open past 4 p.m. The second thing that it was challenged with within its kind of comprehensive plan is that as you move further away from that downtown Cincinnati view toward where you see this image here, is what vitality we did have started to dissipate pretty quickly. And at the same time, this building, I don't know if I have a little cursor here, this building right here was going vacant in an already pretty vacant block. And they asked us they knew we were building out the playbook, they knew who we were and what we cared about, to spend some time applying that methodology to a specific site with a specific outcome of revitalizing that building and this block and in general this part of Bellevue. So here it is looking at the ground level view from the street. Our first step was taking 5 people who had no experience in retail development, in real estate development, in community development, 5 neighborhood residents and 1 city council person, and put the prototype of the book in their hands and walk them through the plays from the community side. First thing we looked at, and it's the first play in the book, is finding the space. And this the space here fits that bill. It's a small space just off to the side of the building. And here, this is where the broker for the building said, this building is valuable because it has 12 parking spaces. Rather than saying this building is valuable because it's got a great location, a great neighborhood, whatever, it really trumpeted the value of those parking spaces. And we said, let's take that asset and rethink how we can use it in a low-cost way to actually return demand to this side of town. And so we created what we called an activation brief for that block to drive a program on there that would return that value, return that demand to that site, and get people's attention and focus and interest in redeveloping, and help the building sale go to somebody who was really interested in seeing that future be realized in a permanent way. So we started working with the families of those 5 volunteers in bringing people together in creative ways to create what in our minds had to be an overtly Kentucky experience. I don't know if you guys have this experience because you're on a border as well, but in Kentucky, northern Kentucky, we have this problem where we have to apologize to Ohioans to get them to cross the river and spend money in Ohio. Historically, especially in Bellevue, we would say that we are Ohio-like. It's just as good as Ohio, just a little cheaper. Come on over. It'll be worth it. Here we've tried to flip that conversation and say, let's be Kentucky proud and program this space with Kentucky proud food, music, beer, what have you, and vendors and makers to give that authentic Kentucky experience that Ohioans, it turns out, will crave because I can rip on Ohio a little bit, they were tired of plain vanilla Ohio and wanted a short trip to something more rewarding. So what's more rewarding than this, right? So we started building out this scene with donated materials and some friends of friends. Music was a big part of it. As I mentioned, this was in a counterintuitive location and nobody knew where it was. And so what we had to do was create pathways, creative pathways for people to come discover this site. We used the guy on the right, Joe, the banjo guy, as kind of our people recruitment tool. So the night of the events, on the weekends, he would walk the main street to the vital part, strumming his banjo, and like a wandering minstrel or a pied piper, whatever your metaphor of the day is, he would bring people down the main street. And all the time, he'd be asking who they are. What are you here for? What are you interested in? So he became a data collection tool for us as we got smarter about who the market was, who wanted to be there. He became kind of an extension of the brand of the event. And we ran this for about 18 months. Took a break in the winter for a little bit. But by those latter months, we were getting 200, 300, 400 people to cram those 12 parking spaces. We were getting vendors there. Food people were spending tons of money on food and on drinking, on the experience of being there into the night. Through that time, a building owner was attracted. The new building owner was attracted by what he saw there. He and his wife wanted to be in the community. They already actually had a building further down the street, and they wanted to be there and provide a new thing. And so they bought the building, and they used the program of this to develop out a new concept for the ground floor. So rather than just making it apartments, which would have been great, or just making it a restaurant that would have been great, they actually created what was called the Fairfield Market, building off of the prototype market, which was the old Kentucky Makers Market. And this is a new concept. They're actually investing in a new retailer that's going to offer small kind of grocery items, and then a deli in the background, and then not residential above, but office space and co-working space, which Bellevue didn't have previously. So this is under construction right now. So the event is actually done. They've used the programming to inspire the space inside, but those 12 parking spaces that the broker had previously been using as the only sales tool for that building is now going to be an extension of the public realm in a street that has no sidewalk dining. And it's going to be our first outdoor patio space in that community and kind of give that gift back to the street. The last experience I want to talk about is at a different scale. So how do we scale that very kind of boutique idea of, a half-acre site? How do we scale it to the scale at which you guys are starting to think about in 3.0? So Kevin and I have been tinkering with this idea for 3 years now, as he mentioned, and we're now starting to incorporate it into all of our urban design and development strategy work that we're doing all over the Midwest and beyond. And this is in Detroit, or surrounded by Detroit. This is the city of Highland Park. Anybody know Highland Park or Detroit at all? So Highland Park is well known for being, at one point, one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest city per square inch in the country, because in that 2 square mile city, Chrysler and Ford were headquartered there. 2011, it left state receivership as one of the poorest communities in all of the country. And in fact, it has become one of the poster childs for Detroit's decline. In fact, many of the photos you see of Detroit's hurting were not in Detroit, they're actually in Highland Park. So before we arrived, they had gone through a very conventional planning process. They had done their comprehensive plan, they had done their land use plan that you see on the right, and that wasn't beginning to touch the depth of issues that they were trying to wrestle with. Their plan was saying to take these remnants of their firehouse to the left, an old city services building to the right, and the city hall to the building behind it, flatten it, create a huge subsidy structure, and give the site away and hope somebody comes and wants to develop some place that, in fact, would look like everywhere else here in this community. And nothing was happening. They created the TIF district, and nothing was happening. They tried giving away the buildings, and nothing was happening. Nobody was showing up. And you can see the kind of level of disinvestment here. We took the 12 TIFA board members, the TIF district board members, on a little walk. This is behind their city hall. 8 of those 12 people had never been behind this building. They had never encountered the kind of magic that this space could create with a little imagination and creativity. And in conversations with the mayor, he was getting frustrated. He's like, I know all the stuff we've been doing. I know what we've been through. Help us figure out a way within our capacity to tell us where we're going. And give us a way to do that. Tell us how to operate in going forward. So we started with just a really creative engagement process. These people had not been engaged. These residents had not been engaged in a very long time. So we had to start with very basic conversations about what they remembered about Highland Park and what they think it could become in the future. Pretty normal type of stuff. And one thing that we uncovered was that not only did they have fond memories of downtown Highland Park, but they weren't even convening civically like they used to. They were not having any festivals, they didn't have any events. Even the churches, which traditionally are the kind of support mechanism for that, weren't really that civically involved. So the first thing that we did was that left-hand type of work, figuring out how to activate their civic awareness, their civic identity, and get people together in ways that they hadn't for a very long time. And so with very low cost, frankly not very sophisticated means, they started throwing events in places that we identified in the first initial strategy here. And you can see some of the setup images and some of the night images there. And then use that as a way, this is kind of as you go through the strategy, use that as a way to start to attract initial amenity providers to come to Highland Park after you've proven some of the initial aspects of that demand. And then use that as a way to then attract housing and other types of development and uses to the downtown. And then as the place matures and investment returns, kind of going for some of those things that previously weren't thought of as possible, the massive redevelopment of the Ford plant, for instance, you see in the middle, as well as along a future greenway that happens to be going through Highland Park. So this incremental approach to realizing extraordinary results was the game plan we gave them. So what does that all look like? Well, this is an aerial view of some of those photos we were just looking at. You see the firehouse on the left, the city hall, and the city maintenance building here on this block. Then you can see the massive original Ford plant in the distance, and you can kind of see the missing teeth that have been created over the years. So the first thing that we did and recommended was continue to grow your activation strategy and your activation work around this space. Be hyper-focused on this block with the intention of redeveloping those 3 buildings. And that over time, it would create the demand and the velocity and the need to fill in those missing gaps around that block. And what's really exciting to me, that's a huge kind of cognitive leap for folks, right? To go from here to here. But again, baby steps are so important. This is a text message I got last week. Actually, this is less than 5 months since we wrapped our formal work. These 2 lumberjacks of people were attracted by that demand work and actually wanted to be in Highland Park, not because, as Kevin mentioned, for what it could be 15 years from now, but what they saw in those buildings today. They didn't want to flatten them. They wanted to get in there tomorrow and start stabilizing those structures and bringing the types of programs that the community identified that they wanted in those buildings. So they actually just purchased those buildings. They didn't have to give them away. They had to sell them at cheap, don't get me wrong, and provide some other support, but they got the outcome that they wanted starting to happen. This is just last week, extremely rewarding. And then just around the corner from there, we engaged in a similar exercise where this is an old laundromat facility on a corridor that people saw a lot of potential on. And through our process, we met Kathy and Brett Stevenson. This is my barbecue slide. And this is a pretty damn good sauce. I know that's risky to say down here. But what Kathy and Brett were representing and what they were innovating with was not necessarily the barbecue sauce, which it was pretty good, but how we can create an ecosystem for food entrepreneurship in Highland Park to get it out of the kitchen, to get out of the living room, and to scale. So providing a facility, an institution essentially, that would take those small-scale entrepreneurs and scale it to a bigger marketplace. And they got very interested through our conversations and walk-arounds of the neighborhood in that laundromat, in this building right here. And we took the same approach there. While they were figuring out what that building could become, how much it would cost to clean it up, what the program was, what the development costs were, and what the infrastructure needed to support that was, let's get them on site with their network now and start getting people focused on food on that site today, even before that work could formally commence. And then over time, we worked into the ultimate build-out of that site with her and her architect to figure out how does that not only integrate on that site, but then how does that become an anchor for the bigger district. So she's actually just closing on the building the first quarter of this year, and then she's going to move forward with her program to build out what you see here. So this whole idea of taking kind of big scale planning and thinking that you guys are all invested in with the 3.0 and dialing it down and calibrating it at the neighborhood level to first confirm and create demand, and then use that demand creation as a way to shape and inform the supply, we think is becoming integral to the way we must think about neighborhoods. And it's stories like these that really speak to why I think we're all in this room, why we kind of wake up every day doing what we do. And it's that belief that places, real kind of authentic places, we think are the best way to unleash human ingenuity, human spirit, and prosperity. And that one of the best ways to do that is to kind of embark on this demand discovery process, this economic uncovery process of bringing neighborhoods back to life and bringing the type of growth that we think is possible to those places. So with that, we can take some questions. Bring Jake and Kevin back up, and thank you very much for having us with you. I guess I'll moderate. First question.
When you had the step in Detroit and you realized that people had not been invested in the neighborhood and pulled them together, and you started talking in this language, what agency or what group was the catalyst that took it to the next step? Was that y'all, or was that someone teaching someone in that community to move forward?
Great question. So in a nutshell, the question was, how did we build capacity in the neighborhood after we kind of left, essentially, to continue that conversation, dig deeper, and perpetuate it? So what we're finding, and Kevin can speak to this because it's kind of his experience as well, is that leadership, it's not going to be earth-shattering. Leadership is important, right? And when we showed up there, they did not know, the TIF or agency, which is responsible for delivering that project, the TIF agency did not know who to engage, how to engage them, or really have the staff or mechanisms to do that. So we were the proxy for a while, right? We were kind of signed up almost as a subscriber to, they subscribed to our services that essentially bridged them as they were building that capacity, bridged to that point where they could pick it up and carry it forward, which is the end game that we all want. But then we built not just those kind of images that you saw on the screen, but we built an operations plan. It essentially became how that staff was going to grow, what kinds of things that they were going to be engaged in, and how they were going to continue to touch the lives of the people working in that.
The staff of the TIF.
Yeah, well, the eventual staff.
Okay.
Yeah, because they didn't even have that.
Okay.
And so when you saw the activation work, that even in its kind of infancy, that was the product of them doing it. We actually did not do that. In some other cases in neighborhoods, as you saw in previous slides, we actually had to be part of the activation part. We love being part of it, fun part. But our eventual goal is scaling this, how to get as many neighborhoods sophisticated in this. And that's really where the playbook as a field guide becomes so important. We think that's that kind of leave behind can allow people to do that demand discovery.
Right here.
Yeah.
My question is for Kevin.
Yes, ma'am.
You stated that when you were in your planning phase, you had to get project and develop some gentrification policies.
Yeah.
Can you speak to what those look like or possibly give us some examples?
Sure. So the question is, what are some of the policies that we're working on around gentrification? And I emphasize working on because we're in that process right now. And I think it really is interesting, as an aside, to think about how neighborhoods come back to life and when you should implement these types of policies. So what we've learned is if we would have tried to implement sort of more restrictions on development at the front end of the process, we probably wouldn't have grown as fast as we did, but we now feel like there's enough momentum where we should be implementing said policies. The ones that we are working on, there's 2 or 3 that we think are really important. One is we want to create a homeowner facade program, so a forgivable loan program for homeowners, because we're starting to see new people moving into the neighborhood, looking across the street and frankly judging a book by its cover and seeing a gutter falling down or paint peeling and going on the city's code enforcement app and citing them, and then all of a sudden the long-term owner has tens of thousands of dollars they have to put in their building, but they're a senior citizen, they can't afford it. So creating a loan program like that is one. Another one is we think it's pretty unfair to give a tax abatement to a developer who comes into the neighborhood and increases the value of the neighborhood and is new to the neighborhood, and then the property value increases on the nearby houses and the taxes increase on the nearby houses. So the developer who was part of increasing the property value gets the tax abatement, but not the long-term residents. So we're looking at a program called Loop in Philadelphia as a model for allowing abatements on certain criteria of homeowners, long-term homeowners, senior citizens, etc. The other is, frankly, and it actually is really incentivizing or putting funding in place to make sure that we have affordable housing in almost every project, multifamily project now. Really quickly, our mayor and city council recently passed a pretty innovative program. So we give 75% tax abatements, 25% goes to schools. We don't take that. We don't abate that. But every developer pretty much across the city asks for 75% tax abatement for 15 years. We are now making that 60% instead of 75. And that 15% is being voluntarily donated to a nonprofit, which is to be set up for the city. And 7.5% of that 15 is going into affordable housing fund to fund affordable housing across the city. And the other 7.5% is going back into the neighborhood where the development's happening to do neighborhood improvements. So that's another one that was just created because we do want to start demanding a set aside of affordable housing and the projects around the neighborhood, and we can't do that unless we have a fund in place to really help support the developer to limit the rents.
What kind of retail and office rents? Retail rents were you getting in the beginning, and where do they go into, and what kind of multifamily rents are you getting?
The question was, what are our retail and multifamily rents? What have they been, and where are they
What are
going?
you projecting?
So at the beginning, there were no comps, virtually no comps at all on either retail or rental. Most of it's just low-income housing, affordable housing, and the retail is largely vacant. Our first projects, so the Grand Flats projects, which is our first, I don't count Firehouse necessarily, but the first big project with residential and retail, we were getting about $10 a square foot on the retail and we pro forma it at like 95 cents a square foot on the residential. It was a really risky project, so there was really no comp. We're now at, we bumped up to 110 and 120, and the big infill project is going to be $1.50 a square foot. So we're at that now, and I think we'll be able to get above $15 a square foot for retail in that project.
That 95 cent on residential was their market rate?
Yeah, it was market rate, 95 cent per square foot, technically affordable, but just not restricted. Yeah.
I was speaking to some of our planners last night actually about incentives for developers when it comes to zoning and ordinances. What types of planning incentives do you guys work with?
So can you describe, so the question is what kind of incentives do we have for developers?
Yes, incentives as it relates to planning.
Oh, well, procedural and planning, we don't really have a lot. What do you want to chime in on that? I was thinking more financial incentives.
Yeah, well, one thing that's kind of interesting, so in Kevin's case, they went through this long, I don't know, it was like, can't remember, form-based code, 18 months?
Yeah.
18-month process to establish a form code in 4 neighborhoods within Cincinnati, with the theory that that would expedite approval process. Came to pass that that wasn't exactly the case in many instances. But what Kevin touched on in his chapter was something that I think is important. That the demand discovery process and the kind of strategic investment planning process together convened a kind of conversation and an understanding about change in place that inherently incentivized an expedited, or at least relatively speaking, an expedited approval process when we had to deviate from that zoning, which is generally the case. So whether the conversation was about parking or scale or amount of retail along a particular street or density, those conversations were much easier to have and thereby happened much quicker and came to resolution in a much better way that inherently incentivized development. In fact, Kevin's got projects going right now that started and are kind of breaking ground quicker than some projects of similar magnitude in other parts of the city that haven't gone through that process. So it's a pretty good comparison. Does that answer the question a little bit? You're not defending the form-based code, right?
No, not at all. So all three of you used the word intentional. And your old friend from Pittsburgh, Mayor Tom Murphy, came and talked to Memphis a couple of years ago and left with a simple elevator speech of be intentional. And can each of you talk about how what you're doing transcends political to stay intentional for the vision of investment in people, investment in place, and investment in initiatives to how to move the needle forward with that long view of plan implementation and incremental development, but staying intentional beyond the politics?
Sure. Yeah. Is this on? Yeah. So with regard to intentionality, I'd say for us, it's meeting people where they are. So instead of instead of being on the 11th floor of a nondescript office building, being in a storefront and being approachable. That's also hand-holding people if they don't have internet access with respect to filling out an application. We've brought people into the office and typed out their applications with them. It's being open and available, having a phone number and being reachable, and holding true to our offerings. When we say we're going to offer X amount of dollars and office space and event space and support, we stand by that and we do that. And then I guess I would also say that we support our grantees whether they're successful or not, whether they're able to finish the project or not. The project for us is the application and the process of the project is a means to bring people in under the tent for us and to develop a cohort of people that care about our city and are going to show up when the next issue hits or hopefully run for office, etc. So that's intentionality for us.
I don't know if this, I think this will get to your question, but I think one of the challenges we all face, and this is part of what the playbook is about, is I think all of us want neighborhood growth. So all of us want cities to work. All of us want neighborhoods to work. We understand that walkable, compact, diverse neighborhoods is better for the social framework of our country, is better for the environmental aspects of our country, and so on, the economy. However, there's a problem that is sort of a brick wall where community is scared of change, and rightly so, and developers are scared of community, somewhat rightly so. They think they're going to come in and spend a lot of money on architectural drawings, and they're going to get shut down at planning commission, right? And so they tend to try not to talk to anybody. I'm not going to talk to them. I'm going to be scared of what I have to say. And so what I'm getting at, I think a big part of our success has been about not being afraid to talk about gentrification, not being afraid to talk about race, and being intentional about those conversations, and being honest about the fact that we don't have all the answers, that none of us do, that cities are just now starting to be developed again. I think most of us have hearts that are in the right places, and we're learning from one another, and there's going to be bumps and mistakes along the way, but we can do it together if we're honest and open and transparent with one another. And I think that applies across nonprofit organizations and city employees and elected officials and so on. There's a long history in cities of pushing people around and not asking them what they want based on the color of their skin. We have to keep saying that, I think, out loud, because when we start developing neighborhoods and people get scared, we can't just say, well, you should just trust us, because you shouldn't. And so I think we've built up a lot of credibility in the neighborhood because we've just showed up to meetings and we listen and we take the arrows sometimes and we don't get angry. We say, we know where you're coming from, let's try to do better. So I think just being intentional around the conversations is a big step.
I'm going to get a little planner theory on it. Those are both really good answers. So cities are messy. The development of cities over time is messy, right? And I guess using the framing of your question about intentionality to describe that is that cities, as a kind of, if you think of them as a living organism, they kind of have this spontaneity and unintentionality to them in some of our most favorite places, right? They've kind of evolved over time, and in some cases they were planned in certain areas, in other places it looked like it was a complete free-for-all. But they were built with a series of very kind of specific, intentional outcomes and needs being solved through investment and growth, right? And so I think the balance that we always have to strike in our work is allowing for the magic of a place to evolve and to acknowledge that in 2018, we don't know what's going to be possible in a certain neighborhood in 2022 if we're successful in those first 4 years. And so it's this balance between allowing this kind of discovery to happen And then describing projects and initiatives, not simply in terms of the goals and aspirations that we're trying to achieve and the metrics that we want to measure success by, but describing projects in a pretty level of specificity, particularly in those early years that people can wrap their arms around. So it's not just kind of here, but you're getting down to the scale of what is meaningful to people on their street, on their block, whatever. And I think just kind of using a very intimate, I guess, example of that is that Bellevue example, the activation of the Old Kentucky Makers Market. I mean, we could have very easily tried to solve the entire Main Street's problems with that, right? Had a planning process and done a charrette or whatever. And that would have been fine, well, but it wouldn't really have solved the problems. And it wouldn't have really engaged the community in a way that we would have gotten really smarter about what was possible there. But through the process of the activation, those 18 months, not only did we engage a lot of people in solving problems around electricity, like how are we going to light this thing? How are we going to get people there? How are we going to slow traffic down on that fast Main Street? But we were attracting people that had traditionally been left out of the conversation. Or that would traditionally feel like if a new restaurant showed up there by whatever means, they probably wouldn't feel that involved in the outcome. And maybe not even feel invited to come into that restaurant. But through the process and seeing who showed up regularly to those events, when we started asking people about the new development, there was this sense of pride. There was this sense of, I was part of this. I'm part of this story, and I'm going to take my kids here. I'm going to be invested in what happens here. And so that at that scale was very intentional about wanting to make that happen. But over time, if you multiply that by 100 different implications across the Main Street or across the community, the overall outcome is pretty non-intentional. It's got this organic quality to it that I think that is what makes cities special and what makes this process for how cities develop organically special that we always have to balance.
What I'm seeing as a challenge here are neighborhoods or suburbs that were built in the 70s and 80s that have small shopping centers. They were never pedestrian friendly. And what's happened is that as that housing ages, people are moving to newer suburbs. The local shopping centers, even the mall, like in Hickory Hill, are completely boarded up. The housing is deteriorating, and people, some of them are interested in moving downtown, some of them are moving to the new suburbs on the green fields. But what can we do to prevent those neighborhoods from just blighting out to where they become mostly boarded up and largely unoccupied when they don't have a center to revitalize?
Take a shot.
Okay. So the question is, the places that were built sort of either inner ring or just outside of the inner ring that were suburban from the get-go in terms of form and everything. How do we bring those? How do we make sure those don't just become dead zones basically in our region? I think you're going to see, for one, I do think we got to have that question about the playbook. The playbook is difficult because it's all about the space and the authenticity of the space. It is more difficult to use in an environment that is very wide open. However, Joe just did a project in Coleraine Township, which is a great example of that, in a strip mall parking lot, and just happened to have this entryway to the strip mall parking lot that had trees lining either side of the driveway, and so it had like a little outdoor room, sort of tree canopy feel, and they did a project called The Orchard, which is getting them to rethink what that strip mall looks like. But I think you're going to hopefully see those places start to redevelop in a more walkable, compact way, and I think that's good. However,
in-laws and increasing density.
Yes, and I think that's good. Although I'm a city person, I believe in the closer to the core we all are, the better in many ways. But I do think we can't ignore the suburbs. So they're going to, I think, hopefully going to change for the better over time, because I think across all demographics you're going to see people wanting this type of lifestyle. But I think cities are going to really win that battle to a degree, because the compact sort of walkable areas that we're building in cities have the sort of buildings. They have built-in diversity. They're just, in many ways, more interesting places. And I apologize if someone lives in the suburbs and is feeling picked on right now. That's not what I'm trying to do. But one example of that, which doesn't necessarily apply to the suburbs, is in Cincinnati. We have Over the Rhine, which is an amazing historic neighborhood where People's Liberty is, the Finley Market. I mean, it's just this authentic, great place. And we built a new place down on the river called the Banks, which is all new between the two stadiums, and retail down there is failing. So I think we're going to struggle with this idea of building new walkable places and what retail looks like and how authentic sort of locally owned retail fits into these places and how they succeed. Also how the internet is changing retail and shifting more towards the smaller, more local, more boutique type retail experiences. So how does that fit into an entertainment destination like the Banks or a suburb?
What role do you see historic preservation playing in this, in your process?
Well, historic preservation, so the question is, what role will historic preservation play in this?
In cities going forward.
And we're wrapping up in a second, is that what that means? Okay, I think maybe it's just saying hi. He was waving. Last question. One, I think we presented, we keynoted a conference in Colorado, a statewide historic preservation conference, because they saw this as a really great historic preservation tool. So with the 5 Points Alley in Walnut Hills, I'll just quickly use that as an example. I think a lot of those buildings get torn down around that alley to create, a catalytic development site if we don't activate and sort of shape that space and let people kind of show where the borders are of that space, and those borders are historic buildings. So I think this process is a great tool to actually highlight the built environment that was shaped by those historic buildings that gave us the alleyways and the nooks and crannies that are so great about our cities. And so I think historic preservation plays a huge role. And one of the biggest pieces of this is picking a space. And one of the first pieces of advice we say is don't pick a giant field. Pick a place that feels like an outdoor room. Pick a place where if you get 100 people in there, like Old Kentucky Makers Market, it feels packed shoulder to shoulder. Last thing you want to do is pick a big site, put 100 people on it, feels like no one's there. And usually those places are bordered by historic buildings. All right, thanks everybody.